Welcome back to the attic. Today we're going to take a quick look at this lens, which is the Sigma 35mm f2 DG DN in the Contemporary series, also the I series. It gets very confusing. I mean, Sigma has some very long product names and this one is no exception. What does make this lens particularly beautiful, as we'll come on to discover, is the build quality, and it is absolutely stunning. This is an 11.5 ounce lens, that's 325 grams. You've got 10 elements in 9 groups. You've got a 52mm front filter thread, and it comes in at $639. We'll see how that compares with a few other options. You've got the Sony, and you've got Samyang / Rokinen's 35mm f1.8s, which are the obvious comparisons. Now, what Sigma has managed to do, let's take this off for a second, is produce something that is quite spectacular. And this feels like a vintage lens. If you've watched my review of the Sigma 65mm, you'll have heard me gush endlessly about the quality of the aperture ring, and that is because the aperture ring sounds like this. It's really nice. And what's special is that this feels and behaves like a vintage cinema lens, but that aperture ring is electronic. So if you turn the aperture, nothing changes in the front of the lens when you look down the front of the lens until you attach that lens to your camera. And how they've managed to replicate the look and feel of a vintage lens is really quite impressive. And that extends to the focusing ring as well. You can hear the cars passing outside before you can hear this. It's pretty quiet. And that is a focus by wire focus ring, and it is super smooth. It doesn't feel like it's focused by wire. Again, it feels like an old cinematic lens or an old vintage lens. You can understand why Sigma has taken this design decision, because they've got to distinguish themselves in amongst Sony and Samyang and Rokinon. And the other thing to consider is that this is also made for the L mount. The specifications and the size are pretty much identical. I think there's one or two small exceptions. And Leica users, as you're probably aware, are quite discerning folk. When you put this on a Sony, you are really spoiled. Like, you suddenly transform this plasticky, flappy-doored, not very aesthetically pleasing body into something that gives you a really tactile, really satisfying experience. And this lens really does make the most of some very, very intelligent design choices. There's not anything about this lens that feels subpar, that is for sure. Points of comparison. So the Sony 35mm f1.8, that is $748. So yeah, a bit more expensive, just over $100 more expensive. And that has a really, really good reputation. If you're going to spend a lot of money on a 35mm f1.8 lens, then the Sony is a really good choice. It gets rave reviews. The other option, if you want to save a serious amount of cash, is the Samyang / Rokinon 35mm f1.8, which is a lens that I own. This I absolutely love, but it does feel like a toy by comparison. It's 7.4 ounces, which is 210 grams, so a lot lighter and a lot cheaper at just under $400 compared to the Sigma. And you're getting similar performance. It's not quite as sharp. The autofocus probably isn't quite as fast, but the amount of money that you're saving, it really is something to consider. But of course, it doesn't feel the same. This feels a bit like a plasticky toy, whereas the Sigma feels like a serious lens. And the other thing you're paying for, obviously, Samyang, Rokinon, yeah, they've been around for a while, but you don't know how long their lenses are going to last. Hopefully this will last a serious amount of time. But the Sigma, they have a reputation, they have quality control, they have good reviews across the internet, so you know pretty much exactly what you're buying, whereas this might be a little bit of a risk by comparison. One interesting difference, the Samyang 35mm f1.8 has various gaskets inside of it to give it some weather sealing. You'll find one on the base, just as you will find it on the Sigma as well. But the Sigma only has that one gasket at the lens mount, which is a bit of an odd choice. You would expect Sigma to put the weather sealing all the way through. Now, my guess is that the build quality on this is so good that it will survive rain just as well as the Samyang, but I'm not about to put that to the test because I need to send this back to Sigma very shortly, and I own the Samyang 35mm 1.8, and it's one of my favourite lenses. The Sigma, I mean, what's to complain about? It's compact, it's not too heavy despite being pretty much a full metal build. There's a fair amount of focus breathing, and you're going to have to expect focus breathing. As soon as you go for the compact form, you are going to get it. And it's the same in the Samyang, and I think to a degree pretty similar on the Sony. Aberrations, not much to speak about. Vignetting, I really couldn't care about. I like vignetting, so I'm not going to complain. It doesn't strike me as being out of place on this lens. I think the only complaint I would have is that, ridiculously, it has too much contrast for me. I shoot in forests a lot, and I want to remove quite a lot of contrast. And yeah, this just gives me a bit too much. They're too punchy almost, which is a stupid complaint. I realise if you like contrast and you like sharp images, you're going to love this lens. So Sigma has a number of lenses in the I series. So there's a 24mm, there is the 45mm, there is this 35mm, and there's the slightly curious 65mm as well. So for me, the 35mm is probably the pick of the bunch, just in terms of my favourite focal length out of the entire I series. And I've really enjoyed shooting with it over the last couple of months. Sigma were kind enough to lend it to me, and it really needs to go back. It went with me on a trip to the Pyrenees Mountains during a period where France wasn't completely locked down, and it's been into the forest with me a fair amount as well. And the performance is second to none. There's not much flaring, there's very little chromatic aberration, and it's funny because I mentioned this in the 65mm review as well. With this styling, you expect to get quite a distinctive look and feel. Because it's got vintage aesthetics, you expect the resulting images and footage to have vintage aesthetics as well. And it just doesn't. They're near perfect. There's no, swirly bokeh, there's no weird vignetting, nothing. And that's not a complaint, that's high praise. This is perfect optics, pretty much, inside something that looks like it was made 50, 80 years ago. In other news, I've been selling postcards on the website for the first time, which has been really good fun actually. I do this little pack of 6. I'll do a full video about it very soon. And I've been bundling these up over the last couple of days. They go into a smart little parcel like this and then get put in the post. You can buy them at andyday.com. If you fancy that, there's presets as well. If you like the tones that I managed to get out of my photographs, you can scoop a pack of presets as well. If you like this video, of course, give it a thumbs up, give me a subscription. It would really help me spend more time in the forest taking photographs. See you next time.